In the last lesson, we talked about contending loyalties, nationalist and non-nationalist loyalties, and we talked about the fact that the whole idea of identity is based on, in part, the ability to reconcile these various contending loyalties. In the current lesson, we want to continue and review at the same time. So we're going to look at class and nationalist loyalties competing. We'll also look at religious and nationalist competing loyalties. And we're going to see about the reconciliation of these various contending loyalties. So again, when we do that, remember that we're doing so within the context of the first related issue, which is again, to what extent should nation be the foundation of identity? And the ability to understand the various nationalist and non-nationalist loyalties that an individual has, because they're key factors that are used as a basis for identifying and distinguishing an individual, and the fact that these these loyalties need to be reconciled to the extent to which nation becomes a foundation of identity is an important consideration. So by the end of this current lesson, you should be able to explain what these non-nationalist and nationalist loyalties are, give examples of conflicting religious and nationalist loyalties, and give examples of conflicting class and nationalist loyalties. And finally, we'll examine the importance of, and you should be able to understand the importance of, as an objective, of reconciling contending loyalties. So let's consider some contending loyalties, and let's consider class loyalties and those class loyalties that would be contending or in competition or in conflict with nationalist loyalties. Now, if you recall, we spoke about this in our introductory lesson as relates to nationalist and non-nationalist loyalties. Class loyalty, which is a type of or an example of a non-nationalist loyalty, is a loyalty that people have for or from a particular social class. And the best example that we gave in the introductory lesson was that of the Third Estate during the French Revolution that stood up to the First and Second Estate and attempted to create a national assembly. Their loyalty came first to their class before it came to that of the monarchy and of the French state of the late 1780s. We also discussed most societies are in fact divided into social economic classes, and that these divisions into socioeconomic classes are often based on wealth or status or education, sometimes career choice, sometimes ancestry or heritage, and often ethnicity. And these all play a role in the division within societies based on social economic classes. Canada, we gave as an example in the introductory lesson, also has social economic classes, and sometimes wealth is a determining factor as to the division of such classes. Now, when people don't accept these divisions, conflict can occur. When people accept these divisions, there really is no conflict. But as we have seen in many instances of history, there have been conflict when in fact, such as during the French Revolution, when people do not accept the divisions, such as in France of the 1780s, when division such as privilege and status was given to two specific social economic classes, and all the burdens of society were placed on another, the Third Estate. Now, disputes do arise between these various divisions based on social economic classes when one class believes they're favored over another, and conflict can result. We certainly saw this during the French Revolution, as the Third Estate certainly saw that the First and Second Estates of French society were very much favored over their estate, and this eventually led to the French Revolution, the overthrow of the French monarchy, and the establishment of a revolutionary government. It also has occurred in other times as well. During Russia, and the Russian Revolution would be another example. Can you think of any other times in history where class loyalty has come into conflict with nationalist loyalty? There would no doubt be many examples. Here's one example. During the Great Depression, which occurred during the 1930s, And the best example was on December 20th, 1932, when about 10,000 farmers who were in desperate economic and financial situations, factory workers, and unemployed people actually gathered in Edmonton to urge the provincial government to help them, to provide some form of assistance. Now, they were acting based on their wealth and status, and so from a social economic standpoint, they were looking at a class loyalty before they were looking at a nationalist loyalty. They wanted, obviously, food, they wanted work, they wanted some hope for the future. Now, these protesters headed for the Alberta legislature, and mounted police officers, swinging billy clubs, actually rode into the crowd to disperse them. The protesters were protesting, they were not rioting, and yet what we see as an example of a class loyalty in conflict with a nationalist loyalty is what happened as a result of the mounted police officers attacking the protesters. 29 people were arrested and many more were injured. Now, these individuals, although not wanting to overthrow the provincial government, were acting on their class loyalty, the fact that they wanted food and work and some form of assistance. And so you can see that there was an example from the standpoint of class loyalty, and that it was in conflict with and clashed with, from the perspective of the government and of the police force, a nationalist loyalty, or at least a regional loyalty to the provincial government. How about some religious loyalties in conflict or in contention with a nationalist loyalty? Well, in Canada we have freedom of religion, and this is guaranteed by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. One of the fundamental freedoms is freedom of conscience, belief, and expression. And people with various religious loyalties can respect one another's belief and typically coexist peacefully. But, and we talked about this in the introductory lesson, in many countries there are religious and nationalist loyalties that are at tension and sometimes come into conflict. Iraq is the best example, and we talked about this. Iraq, country in the Middle East, which had been invaded by the United States, and with its dictator overthrown over the last 10 years, has faced an enormous amount of violence and conflict that has resulted between nationalists and class or non-nationalist loyalties. Here you see a map of Iraq within the Middle East, and then you see the actual country in its position in relation to the globe, and it is a smaller country, but a significant country from the standpoint of its importance in relation to oil and its influence in the Middle East. And we understood that in Iraq, with the vast majority of people being Muslim, there is a split into two main groups or sects. The majority of the Muslim population of Iraq are Shiites, but there are also Sunnis. And these two form two sects, two of the major sects of the Muslim religion. And they basically disagree as to how to interpret the Quran or the Muslim Holy Scripture. And this disagreement has affected their nationalist loyalties. In other words, they've taken precedence, their religious loyalties have taken precedence over their nationalist loyalties and have sparked violence and conflict. There's been numerous killings almost on a daily basis over the last 10 years in Iraq, all based on the split between Shiites and Sunnis and their fear that one group will get political control over the other. Let's continue with Iraq as an example of tension and conflict between class as a non-nationalist loyalty and nationalist loyalties. In Iraq, the Shiites make up approximately 60% of Iraq's population. The Sunnis make up about 35%, so they're a minority. But for most of the last 50 years, the Sunnis have actually had political control of the state of Iraq. Now, this is not very usual because in most Muslim countries in the Middle East, Sunnis make up the vast majority of the population, as much as 85 and 95%. Iraq, however, is one example where the typical Sunni majority is not in place. As well, Iraq also has a substantial Kurdish population. This is a non-Arab ethnic group that lives in the north of Iraq, and most of those happen to be Sunni as well. Now, part of the problem is that the Sunnis and their Kurds tend to dislike religious regimes, and the Shiites want to impose a religious state, a Muslim state, where the Shiite religion or the Shiite sect of Islam forms the basis of that state. And so there is tension that results between these two sects. Now, the Shiites have a problem. Their desire to establish a fundamentally Muslim state, their problem is with secular politics. In other words, they believe that religion plays an ultimate role in politics, whereas many of the Sunnis believe that Iraq should be, while it would be Muslim in essence, religion would not play as strong a role in the political affairs of the country. And so this creates tensions between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Now, let's just look at this for example. Here's an example question was asked: would Iraq be a better place if religion and politics were separated? Now notice the divergence. 68% of the Kurds, the non-Arab ethnic group in the north of Iraq, say yes, it would be much better if religion was not a major role in politics. And as much as 53% of the Sunnis say that it would be good for religion not to play a strong role in politics, whereas only 22% of the Shiites believe this. And so we see that example of tension as a result of differing views not only on religion but on the role religion should play. And so we see how religious loyalties come into competition and open conflict with nationalist loyalties. Here's another important example. Would you describe yourself as Iraqi above everything else? Well, here's an ethnic tension and loyalty coming into place when we see the answer to the question. Only 17% of the Kurds see themselves as Iraqi, whereas only 57% of the Sunnis see themselves as Iraqi, whereas 71% of the Shiites see themselves as Iraqi. And so again we see both class and ethnic loyalties coming into conflict. Excuse me, not class, religious and ethnic loyalties coming into conflict with nationalist loyalties. So which group would be more likely to view religion as a foundation of the Iraqi nation? Well, obviously that would be the Shiites. And what about as a non-nationalist loyalty? Well, again, perhaps the idea of religion becomes a non-nationalist loyalty for those such as the Sunnis and the Kurds. So again, we see religion playing a huge role in relation to contending loyalties between religious, as an example of non-nationalist loyalty with nationalist loyalties, between the Shiites and the Sunnis. We even see an ethnic loyalty between Arabs and Kurds, again as an example of a non-nationalist loyalty contending with a nationalist loyalty. And what about class? Well, it's interesting. Typically the Shiites were poor, and of course the Kurds were also poor, and so one wonders if class has also played a role in relation to the contending loyalties within Iraq. At any rate, what we do understand is that sometimes these contending loyalties, both non-nationalists and nationalists, whether they're religious, ethnic, or class, come into conflict and play a huge role in what occurs in relation to not only identity, but into what occurs within a nation.